And a warm welcome to all the participants. At the time to welcome our college management of Rajapalayam Rajus College and the president, secretary of Rajapalayam Rajus College and the principal of Rajapalayam Rajus College and the faculty members and the students of Natural Club 2. A warm welcome to our resource person Erin ma'am and also our moderator Saili 7th ma'am. It's a happy World Orangutan Day to all of the participants. Thank you. Ma'am, Saili ma'am.
I'll take it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you
So
ma'am.
I'll just give a quick introduction of Dr. Erin and then she can take over. So Dr. Erin Kane is an ecologist, researcher, and science communicator who studies the impacts of environmental variation on wild primates. Erin is currently an affiliated researcher at Boston University and the Gunung Palung Orangutan Conservation Project, where she studies orangutan life history and the development of ecological competence in relation to their challenging and unpredictable habitat in Indonesian Borneo. This is one of the reasons people celebrate International Orangutan Day, conservation of orangutans. She also studies feeding ecology and endocrinology of West African primate communities, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire. And so, again, feeding ecology and endocrinology are one of the most interesting subjects when it comes to primatology, and you learn a lot, and it's fun. It's really fun. Erin received her PhD and master's in anthropology from the Ohio State University, and her BA is from Washington University in St. Louis. So over to you, Dr. Erin.
Well, thank you all so much for inviting me to speak to you and for spending World Orangutan Day with me. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully, all right, I think, can you all see my PowerPoint fine? Okay, perfect. Yeah. So again, thanks so much to Saili and everyone for inviting me to speak to you. Today, I am excited to talk about some work that I've been doing during my postdoctoral research on slow growth in an unpredictable environment, the double burden of orangutan mothers. So life history, as a kind of a theory, explains the ways that animals apportion their energy over the course of their lifespan. And we tend to think of them as kind of two dichotomies. You have animals with a fast life history, which reproduce pretty early, have many offspring at a time, and don't live particularly long. By contrast, animals with a slow life history take a pretty long time to reproduce. They usually only have one offspring at a time, and they live very long lives. And these lives, especially their early parts of their lives, have long periods of growth, development, and many opportunities for learning. If we look across the mammals in general, primates have a really long life history, an extended life history with a very long period of development during their juvenile period. And sometimes, especially kind of in older theories, people explain this as a function of primates' really complex social systems. So the idea is that if you are one macaque in a group of 70 animals, you need to understand who you are in relation to everybody else and how you fit in, how you're supposed to interact, who's dominant to you, who are you dominant to, who do you groom, whom grooms you, things like that, right? So understanding what you're expected to do as a primate takes a lot of time and growth and development. You need to understand all of this complicated social network and social interactions. So given this, if we take the fact that orangutans have the longest and most extended life history of any primate, we might expect this is because they have a really challenging, they have a really complicated social system as well. Orangutans have the longest interbirth interval of any primate, just about 8 years between babies, and a relatively late age at sexual maturity. So orangutan females don't have their first offspring until they're 14 or 15 years old. So, does this then imply that they're highly socially complex? Well, it turns out not really. Orangutans are what we call semi-solitary. So usually, Usually, an orangutan moves around the forest by themselves. Adult females will often travel with their very young offspring, and will sometimes travel with older daughters. And occasionally you have consortships between females and males. But basically, we say that orangutans are in a party, are interacting with each other if they're within 50 meters, right? They're very far from each other. They're often moving through the forest by themselves. So really, it's not the sort of social complexity that we might expect if, this extended life history is a function of social complexity. Now, I don't mean this to say that orangutans are not socially complex. Like I said, they travel together occasionally. And particularly interestingly, orangutan males have a form of bimaterism, where you have flanged males. This male on the right here, you can see he's got these giant cheek pads. He gets really, really large, and he has particular behaviors that distinguish him from these unflanged males over here, who in many ways are the same size and look the same as adult females. So especially during reproduction, the social complexity of orangutan systems is really important. But it doesn't seem like it's a sort of social complexity that would drive a really extended childhood, because these are things that come into play, especially as adults, as reproductively mature individuals. So if that's not the case, there must be some other reason for why orangutans have this extended childhood. So with that in mind, let me take you to the forests of Indonesian Borneo. So Indonesia, of course, is a series of islands in Southeast Asia. And the orangutans that I study live in Mount Palang, or Gunung Palang, in Indonesia National Park here in Western Borneo. And it is a truly beautiful forest to work in. It's a forest that's dominated by dipterocarp trees. So those are very, very tall trees. And it's just sort of an open understory. It's a really lovely place to work. There are orangutans, there are macaques, and several other kinds of monkeys. There are Malayan sun bears, clouded leopards. It's a beautiful, beautiful place in the world. But what makes it a particularly interesting place to study orangutans is that the dipterocarp trees that dominate this forest reproduce in what's called mast fruiting events. So during mast fruiting events, most of the trees in the forest produce a lot of fruit at a particular time. And then for another unpredictable period of time, most of the trees in the forest don't produce fruit. So this is a graph of fruit productivity over a period of a couple of years. And you can see there are these spikes in fruit availability when there's an actual mast event. But most of the time, there's significantly less fruit available in the environment. And these masts occur potentially as a kind of a consequence of El Nino, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's really unpredictable, but it's about once every 3.5 to 4 years. And so what that means is that most of the time, there just isn't a lot of fruit available in these environments. And orangutan diets shift pretty dramatically in response to the changing fruit productivity. So when fruit is available, the amount of kilocalories they can eat like 3,000 kilocalories of fruit in one day when it's available. But most of the time, they're making up the bulk of their diet from leaves and bark and pith, these things that are much more readily available in the environment, regardless of whether or not there's a mast, but things that are a little bit more challenging to actually extract nutrients from. So yeah, there are these major differences in quality of resources depending on whether or not the forest is in the middle of a mast. So these are some of the preferred fruits of orangutans when they're available. Things like rambutan and durian that are, most humans enjoy eating, but fruits that are often really high in carbohydrates and sort of easily metabolizable forms of energy. And when there's a lot of fruit available, orangutans really just gorge themselves. So this is a picture of Walima that I took during a mini mast. So Walima sat in this tree for 4 hours, and she literally stuffed her face with fruit. If you look at this picture, I don't know how well you can see it, but she's got 4 fruits in her mouth at one time. she's also holding a fruit in both of her feet. And so she just sat and stuffed her face and took in just unbelievable quantities of fruit and calories. So that's what happens when the environment is sort of rich and there's a mast. But on the other hand, most of the time, those fruits are not so readily available. And what they're eating are things like bark, cambium, and pith from the inner parts of reeds and bark, unripe fruit, seeds, termites, things that take a lot more effort to actually extract calories from. So this is an adult female who's eating the cambium and pith at the base of these epiphytes. They're things that are available in bulk, but they take a lot more effort to extract nutrients from, just because of how mechanically and chemically protected they are. So how does this affect orangutan life history? Well, we know that orangutans take a long time to grow and develop because we have that just about 8-year interbirth interval. And we know that orangutan environments are highly unpredictable, and so potentially these two things are linked in some capacity. And the way that we've been able to link them is this ecological risk aversion hypothesis, which was developed by Jansen and Carol Van Schaik back in the early 90s. And so what this hypothesis says is that large-bodied animals have low predator risk. Indeed, in Borneo at least, there's really nothing other than humans that can prey on orangutans. On Sumatra, they have tigers that they deal with, but on Borneo, there are really essentially no predators of orangutans. In an unpredictable environment, large-bodied animals risk starvation if they grow and develop too quickly. Right? If you are a small orangutan and you become really big over the course of a year or two, and then all of a sudden there isn't fruit available, potentially you're just going to starve. And so by extending their period of growth and development, large-bodied animals can mitigate the risk of starvation. And so it seems like, and we hypothesize that, orangutans' extended life history is an ecologically risk-averse strategy. One way that we can see this playing out is that great apes as a group of primates nurse for a very long time compared to other primates, and orangutans nurse for even longer. So this is sort of the pattern on the left that we see in most primates, monkeys and lemurs and galagos and lorises and things. Basically, offspring's energy needs grow pretty expansively over the initial part of their early juvenile period, but they're able to meet all of those energy needs with milk from their mother. And by the time offspring energy needs start to peak, and then they incorporate solid food, they stop nursing, weaning happens pretty quickly, and they're able to meet their energy need almost immediately once they're weaned with just solid food in their environment. On the other hand, what we see with most great apes is that the period at which they become too big for their mother's milk to meet all of their energy needs happens pretty early in their development, relatively speaking. And so there's a period of supplementation where they're still relying on their mother, they're still nursing, but they're also incorporating lots and lots of solid foods. And so these two pieces combine to provide the energy that they need to grow and develop. And what we see in orangutans, or at least what we suspect might be happening in orangutans, is that there are actually peaks and valleys in this sort of nursing intensity during the earlier period of development. So young orangutans, rely on milk for most of their calories. And then at some point in time, maybe there's a mast and there's relatively easy food available in their environment. And so they're able to eat fruit, and they don't really need to rely on their mothers as intensively. And so they're actually getting most of their energy here from solid food, but then it stops being a mast. There's much less fruit available. And so they are suddenly trying to figure out how to eat bark and pith and extract all of their calories from something that's both mechanically and sort of chemically challenging. They're not able to extract all the calories they need, so they start to rely on their mother's nursing again. So we see this cyclicity in the amount of nursing intensity in orangutans. And the other thing that's important is that it actually extends for a really, really long time. So orangutans continue to go back to their moms and continue to nurse occasionally throughout their growth and development. And so what this means is that orangutans actually have a really long period over which they can sort of continue to rely on their moms. to handle their really variable environment. They can develop the ability to eat complicated resources over about 8 years, because they can actually continue nursing for about 8 years, which is pretty crazy. So if we look at some of the other primates that I've studied, so things like these sooty mangabes who live in Cote d'Ivoire, they eat really, really hard seeds. The majority of their diet is comprised of seeds that are about as hard as cherry pits. And this is about a 7-month-old juvenile sooty mangabe, and he's already crunching through these really, really hard seeds because they just don't have a buffer. They have to be able to handle these mechanically challenging foods. And we see the development of tool use behaviors, and we see sort of, by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, young chimpanzees are starting to be, not great at, but relatively competent at things like termite fishing and sort of other complicated behaviors. But orangutans can continue, there's a little bit less pressure on them because they can always go back and nurse if they're not able to extract enough calories from their environment. We know from some work that I've done with some students that juveniles and adults process foods very, very differently. So what we've been doing is actually looking at the ways that they orally process foods, counting the ways that they, the number of times that they chew and kind of their manual extraction. There's been some great work by Carl Schupli also looking at the ways that juveniles and adults learn to process foods. And what we can see is that in general, juveniles are less efficient at processing foods than adults. They chew more, they just kind of eat things weirdly compared to adults. They, gnaw things a lot. They don't really know which teeth to use most efficiently. And so particularly this seems to come through when they're eating more complex foods. So things like bark, or fruits that have a hard outer shell. These are things that they're really harder for them to eat, or they're less efficient at eating, and so they probably have to work harder to extract nutrients and calories than adults do. Interestingly, these tend to be the foods that mothers share with their offspring. So food sharing is a thing that we see with orangutans, where mothers will more or less willingly give up foods that they're eating to their offspring. And the ones that they tend to be more willing to give up are these more complicated foods. And so, like I said, because orangutans are semi-solitary, they don't have access to a whole range of individuals in their group, right? If you're a baby, if you're a baby chimpanzee or a baby sooty mangabe, you have, 70 other individuals, 110 other individuals in your group that you can watch eating, and you can sort of pick up, how does your big sister termite fish? How does this unrelated female crack open these Saccoglottis seeds? But if you are an orangutan, you really only have your mother to learn foraging skills from. Potentially, if you have an older sibling traveling with you, you can learn from her as well. But really, it's up to your mother. And so we see that orangutan juveniles and infants spend a lot of time observing their moms eating, trying to steal her food, and trying to, use her to learn how to handle these sort of complicated resources. So in general, for orangutans, for juvenile orangutans, their life is, it's not cushy necessarily, but there's less pressure on them than there might be otherwise, because they can always fall back on their mom. If the environment is too complicated, there's not enough fruit, things are too hard or too, mechanically challenging or too chemically challenging for them to eat, they can just go and start nursing. This is a pretty old baby to be nursing. This is about a 4-year-old who's nursing, and that's great for the juveniles. But for moms, this is probably a pretty extensive burden, right? If you are an adult female and you have a 4-year-old who's starting to nurse, or even we see juveniles nursing as old as 7 years old, right? This is something that's really a burden for you, energetically speaking, because of how much effort lactation takes. And we think it might also be particularly taxing during low fruit periods, when we already know that they're not taking in as many calories, and they probably are operating at sort of a lower energy balance because they're expending more energy than they're able to take in, given the complexities of the environment. So what we wanted to understand is what are the consequences of fluctuations in fruit availability and orangutans' slow development, specifically for adult females. How do moms cope with this challenging environment? And we predict that offspring behavior changes with age. This isn't like a wild prediction. It seems pretty reasonable to expect that over the course of 8 years, we'll see changes in the ways that baby orangutans behave. But also, we predict that offspring's behavior is not influenced by fruit availability because they have their moms to buffer them. So it shouldn't matter to a baby orangutan if there is a lot of fruit available or if there isn't a lot of fruit available, because they can always go to their mom to supplement those calories with nursing. On the other hand, we predict that maternal behavior is also going to change with offspring age. Again, probably not surprising, but if you have a 1-year-old baby who you're carrying around, you're probably going to move through the forest differently than if you have a 7-year-old that you're, traveling through the forest with. But we also suspect that maternal behavior will be influenced by food availability, because they're the ones who are going to be buffering those offspring when there isn't a lot of food availability. And so they're the ones who are going to be suffering from a potentially low energy balance if they both have to support their own somatic, caloric needs, and then also deal with this 6-year-old or 2-year-old who's nursing really intensively. So like I said, I will take you back to the rainforests of Gunung Palang National Park in West Borneo, or in Indonesia, Kalimantan is the particular state. And this is where I do my research in Gunung Palang National Park. And so, like I said, it's a beautiful place to work. It's nestled at sort of the between these two mountains. This is where our camp is located. And so there's a mountain that goes up basically right behind our camp. And then we're surrounded by peat swamp and alluvial forest and bench forest, freshwater swamps. It's a really heterogeneous environment. And so these are some of the home ranges, basically, of the orangutans that we study. And so you can see some of the orangutans are in different kinds of environments. There's a lot of overlap in their home ranges, even though they're semi-solitary. But this is sort of the environment that we're moving through as we're studying the orangutans. And let me pause here to say that the research that I do is part of the Gunung Palang Orangutan Conservation Project. At this point, and for the past year, we've always relied heavily on our Indonesian counterparts and collaborators. But this past couple of years, it's been incredibly important, and they've been incredibly valuable and just amazing collaborators, because we haven't been able to send anyone from the United States, where many of our researchers are based, to do research or do any sort of project management. And so our employees and our staff have really done an amazing job keeping the project going in really challenging circumstances during COVID. So let me just, above anything else, none of this research would be possible without all of our Indonesian collaborators and the Park Service and things like that. So the way that we collect our data is through these full-day follows of identified individuals. Here we have Dang and Sabda, who are in the middle of collecting, it looks like potentially collecting a fecal sample here, trying to see where it landed and where it came from. But I have identified about 180 different orangutans over the course of this research project, and we follow them from when they get out of their nest in the morning until when they leave their nest at night. We collect continuous behavioral data. We also do a bunch of ecological sampling, so collecting any of the foods that they eat, doing sort of large-scale surveys for food availability. And so this data that I'm going to present to you today comes from about 1,900 full-day follows of adult females, and then about 1,000 full-day follows of juveniles and infants over the same period. And like I said, we do this habitat-wide phenology because food availability fluctuates so much, and we think that it's pretty fundamental to understanding really anything about orangutan ecology. we really need to have a strong handle on what food is available in their environment. And so we have a series of plots and transects where we monitor fruit and flower productivity every month. And then we also do nutritional ecology on some of the foods that we collect. So we're able to understand the caloric value of these foods, and then also break it down into macronutrients. So things like how many calories are they getting from carbohydrates versus protein and things of that nature. Data analysis was conducted mostly using R. We analyzed the data with generalized linear mixed models. Dependent variables here are activity budget and travel distance. Our random factors are individual ID and year. And so what's nice about using generalized linear models is that it sort of allows us to, ignore the fact that we have, or at least account for the fact that we have unequal sample sizes between some individuals. And our fixed factors here, so sort of our independent variables, are offspring age and food availability. For mothers, we also estimated calorie intake per hour, and that's a fixed factor. So we're able to do that because we know things like feeding rates. We're not able to do that for juveniles because as of yet, we don't have a good sense of exactly what caloric intake they're getting from nursing. So we wanted to understand how age and food availability influence offspring behavior. So the first thing that we see is that the amount of time that offspring spend clinging decreases with age. So orangutans under the age of 2 spend, on average, a little bit more than half of the day clinging to their mom, as much as the entire follow clinging to their mom. By the time they get to the age of 2, they're spending around a quarter of the day clinging to their mother, and by the time they're 4, they basically are not clinging to their mother at all. They're traveling pretty much independently the whole day. If we think about specifically when the mother is traveling, we see that adult females travel around 8 to 10% of their full day follow, and juveniles under the age of 2 basically cling for that whole period. So young orangutans are not moving independently by themselves. Orangutans between the ages of 2 and 4 cling a little bit less, around 5% of the time on average. And then orangutans over the age of 4 basically don't cling while the mother is traveling. So they basically move entirely independently. And you can see there's a lot of variation in this data, but this is sort of the blocks are sort of the average values, or the majority of the values. Kind of the converse of that is that the amount of time that orangutans spend traveling independently, that increases with age. So unsurprisingly, juveniles under the age of 2 basically don't travel independently at all, around 0% of the day. And by the time they get to the age of 4, they're traveling independently for about 7 to 8% of the follow. Particularly interesting, the amount of time that orangutans spend playing, that young orangutans spend playing, also decreases with age. So juveniles under the age of 4 will spend around a quarter of the day playing. This is mostly solitary play because most of the time they're not with other orangutans. Sometimes they sort of rope their moms into playing. You can see them like hanging off of their moms or whacking her with branches and stuff. But a lot of the time they're just like bouncing around while she's foraging or resting. They're, practicing biting. A lot of it is really intense sort of locomotor play. So they're learning how to do things like bridge gaps and play with branches and see how compliant substrates are and things like that. So play for these really young orangutans is important, but you can see that it declines pretty sharply by the time they reach the age of 4. And by the time they're 6-year-old orangutans, they're playing very, very little. But interestingly, the amount of time that they spend playing, regardless of age, increases with food availability. I should say here that, we sort of lack data when there's a lot of fruit available. There's, because of just the consequence of how these forests work, we have a lot more data when there isn't a lot of fruit than when there is a lot of fruit. So I'll say with caution that time spent playing increases with fruit availability regardless of age. So what we see sort of overall is that age, but not food availability, significantly predicts the amount of time that orangutan juveniles and infants spend clinging and traveling. Age and food availability, though, significantly predict the amount of time that orangutans spend playing. So regardless of fruit availability, young orangutans play more than older offspring. Regardless of age, orangutans play more when there's more fruit available. On the other piece of this, we want to understand how offspring age, food availability, and caloric intake influence maternal behavior. An interesting thing that we see is that the amount of time that mothers spend resting during the course of their follow actually increases slightly but significantly with offspring age. So mothers spend more time resting when they have juveniles between the ages of 4 and 6 than when they have younger juveniles. And so that's just a consequence potentially of energy intake. It might be an artifact of our sample, but it's interesting that the amount of time that they spend resting increases as offspring age. The time spent resting decreases, though, as they eat more calories. So when they eat fewer calories, they rest more. And probably this is an adaptation to cope with just not eating as many calories, right? You can conserve energy by resting more when there's less fruit available. We do see that the amount of time that they spend traveling also increases with offspring age. And this is significant across different age and sex or different age classes. So mothers of offspring over the age of 4 travel more than mothers with offspring under the age of 4. And again, you can think back to how much time young offspring spend clinging. Well, mothers have clinging offspring while they're traveling when they have offspring under the age of 4, and their offspring are able to travel independently when they're over the age of 4, and so that might be some piece of why this time spent traveling changes. Again, these are slight but significant changes in their activity budgets. And the amount of time spent traveling actually decreases slightly as calories eaten per hour increases. And this is something that's a little bit puzzling, but I have a few ideas that I'll touch on at the end of the talk. And finally, we see that daily travel distance increases with offspring age. So mothers with offspring over the age of 4 travel slightly longer distances over the course of a single day than mothers with offspring under the age of 4. And like time spent traveling, daily travel distance also decreases slightly, so as caloric intake increases. So when there's less food available, orangutans travel slightly more. When there's more food available, orangutans are traveling, their daily travel distance is slightly shorter. And again, the same caveat here that we have less data in these high caloric intake or high food availability periods. So to summarize our maternal data, we see that the time resting, time traveling, and the distance traveled increases as offspring get older. We see that the time resting, the time traveling, and the distance traveled, though, decrease as caloric intake increases. So when mothers have, sorry, I always get these mixed up, so let me take a breath. When mothers have younger offspring, they travel less, they rest less, and they travel shorter distances. And so these things, there are some ways that we can tease this apart. What basically all of these data taken together show is that food availability and offspring age act to constrain maternal behavior. Regardless of food availability, infants cling to their mothers until they can travel independently. And when food availability is low, offspring are able to trade off some of these developmentally important behaviors like play, perhaps as a consequence of this low fruit availability that may even be affecting their mothers. So play is a developmentally important behavior, but it's not critical for survival. On the other hand, infants under the age of 2, they're not able to travel independently. So there's nothing that they really can't trade off by traveling independently if they're not physically capable of it. And so these are just sort of realities that orangutan mothers have to cope with. They have to be able to they have to be able to carry their babies when they're under the age of 2. Mothers rest less, and travel shorter distances when offspring are young. That all suggests to me that there is some sort of constraint that having young babies places on mothers. And like I said, mothers rest much less, travel slightly less, and travel slightly shorter distances when they eat more calories. And one thing that I think might explain this, and this is data that I'm excited to kind of dive into at some point soon, is that I think they might be spending more time feeding. And so one of the things that happens during these high fruit periods is that dipterocarp trees, which are really, really big trees, produce fruit. And so you can just basically sit in the same tree. Remember back to that picture I showed you of Walima with like 5 fruits stuffed in her mouth? She sat in that same spot for 4 hours. She didn't have to travel because there was so much fruit available right in her immediate environment. And so I suspect that that might sort of account for why mothers are traveling less and traveling shorter distances when there's lots of fruit available. So what seems to me to be pretty clear is that orangutans' early childhood constrains their moms or serves as a burden, when they're pretty young, when they need to be carried, when they're nursing more intensively. But what's not clear to me quite yet is how much of a burden they are later in their development. And so the thing that we need to do here is unpack this sort of big black box of lactation and nursing. As I'm sure many of you know, it's really hard to catch nursing and to understand how many calories an individual is getting from its mother when it's nursing, because oftentimes they're up in the trees and we don't have a great view. We can see that there's contact between offspring's mouths and nipples, but we can't actually tell how much milk they're getting in at any point in time. Often we see things like comfort nursing where they're not actually getting any milk. And then because we don't follow orangutans at night, but we know that mothers share nests with their offspring up to the age of 7 or 8 years old, there's almost certainly the possibility that they're nursing overnight, and we just don't ever see that. So understanding what the caloric impact of nursing is, especially for these older offspring, is really important, but it's something that we don't know, right? And so something really exciting that's happened over the past year is that I was awarded a grant from the Leakey Foundation to use isotope ratios to track the intensity of nursing between mothers and of offspring of different ages. And so what we're able to do is look at the fecal samples of offspring and compare them to mothers. And you can see as offspring are taking in more milk and more calories from milk, their fecal samples actually have enriched isotope ratios. And then you can sort of trace that back to as they incorporate more solid foods, their isotope ratios approach those of their mothers. And this is some really cool work that researchers like Laurie Reitzma and Lelia Badescu have demonstrated for other primates. So I'm really excited about applying this to orangutans. Our samples right now are in the process of being shipped to the lab for analysis. So keep an eye out, because hopefully we'll have exciting things to say about nursing in older orangutan juveniles soon. But let me close by saying that human evolution, and as an anthropologist, I sometimes frame these stories about wild primates in the frame of human evolution. We see that human evolution is a story of adapting to unpredictable environments. And I think this is something that's really salient given the climate change news that has come out recently, right? We know that our species has spent a lot of time adapting to unpredictable environments, just like orangutans did. And what we see is that humans have really evolved along sort of a different trajectory of coping with climate change or, unpredictable environments than orangutans have. We support our helpless babies, and our ancestors supported their helpless babies through a complex social network where we have pooled resources for food and different individuals to carry babies. And we have this web of other people or other Australopithecines or other Homo erectus that we can rely on to raise our helpless babies. Whereas adult female orangutans really only can rely on themselves. And so they're the ones who are taking on the full picture of what it means to raise juvenile to adulthood in a complicated and challenging environment. And so one thing I really love about studying orangutans and their really long juvenile period is that it helps it gives us a foil or sort of an alternative to understand what our species could have done. It gives us a kind of an opposite to look at to understand our species' own evolutionary trajectory. But it also highlights how important it is to preserve these critically endangered animals in their own right? If it takes us 8 years to grow an orangutan in this complicated and challenging environment, those are 8 years that each orangutan needs. And if they're living in an environment that's, being cut out from under them, or that is being flooded, or rainfall is changing as a consequence of climate change, that unpredictable environment becomes even less predictable and even more challenging for mothers to cope with and be able to raise babies as successfully as they do. So with that, let me say terima kasih. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you and for coming and spending part of your day on this World Orangutan Day talking to me. And I think that we probably have plenty of time for questions. So I'll let Sally monitor that. But thank you so much. And thank you to all of our funders and our team and the folks in Indonesia who allow us to conduct this research.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Erin. Thank you so much.
No.
So, yeah. So, Professor, do we have any questions?
No, ma'am. At present, there is no question from the participant side.
Oh.
they are simply blinking like I don't know what they are really stunned, ma'am.
Okay. So, Erin, I had one question. It's not a question really, but I was just curious. In one of your slides, you mentioned how these orangutans really depend on their mothers, and you said 8 years is a really long time when even if it comes to primates, right? So and the interval between two offsprings is what, 7 years, I guess,
Yeah, 7 to
7.5.
8 years.
Yeah, yeah. So that's also a very long interval, right? The third thing what I wanted to say is you also mentioned about mast fruiting, which takes place every 3 or 4 years. So, so I was just curious if you noticed, peak of births during mast fruiting.
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, we just don't have enough observations of births and things. But you do see that, so one thing that I had never really thought about studying orangutans compared to studying other primates is that when you're with a group of mangabes or a group of macaques, you have like 50 individuals that you're looking at once, right?
Yes.
So you can see every year there are 10 babies or whatever. And in orangutans, you only see one person or one orangutan per day, right? So just like it takes a lot longer to build up sample sizes to be able to say anything with confidence. But so I don't know that there are obvious peaks of births around fruit availability or around masts, but we know that mothers return to cycling based on their condition, right? So when they have taken in enough calories and they have enough of an energy balance to support cycling again, that's when they start cycling when they become reproductively active. And so probably those are things that happen. If you have an older a 6 or 7 year old, you might start cycling if there's a mast. Whereas if there's not a mast, you might hold off on cycling again until your energy balance is increased.
Exactly. That's very interesting. Yeah. So one of the person has asked, is there any place where orangutans are seen in India where we can research about them? So I can give you 100% guarantee that we don't have orangutans in India, but we do have many other primates who are as charismatic and as interesting as the orangutans. And about the research part, I think Dr. Erin can answer that if she, yeah, Dr. Erin. He's asking where can we research about orangutans?
Yeah, so there are, the primate communities in India are just spectacular. And one of the things that I would really like to do at some point is come and see. I would love to see a lion-tailed macaque in the wild.
But yeah, half of them are notorious, I'll tell you. The primates in
yeah,
India,
no,
half
that's
of
what
them
I
are
hear.
notorious.
That's what I hear. So yeah, I'm very jealous of having access to all these amazing primates without having to travel across the world. But as far as researching orangutans, so orangutans are found in Indonesia and Malaysia. Those are the only two places in the world where you have wild orangutans. And there are a bunch of really excellent research projects that do really cool and really accessible sort of education. So Gunung Palang Orangutan Conservation Project, where I work, I think does great work. The Borneo Conservation Fund is another one that does great work. And because today is International Orangutan Day, lots and lots of people are doing lots of kind of educational things. So if you just look on social media for International Orangutan Day or World Orangutan Day, you'll be able to find kind of the places that are doing cool research where you can read more about them.
Yeah. So one other person has asked, what about the ecological importance of orangutan in the forest?
Yeah, so orangutans we know are important seed dispersers for a bunch of trees. They travel longer distances than a lot of other animals that are eating these same fruits in the forest, and so their acts as seed dispersal is really important. And we also know a grad student in my lab just finished her dissertation looking at seed dispersal, and one of the things she found is that there are lots of seeds that actually need to pass through orangutan guts in order to successfully germinate. So that's one thing. But I think another really important thing and something that is exciting about International Orangutan Day is that they are really sort of flagship species to conserve the habitats that they're found in. And they're not the only animal in the forest, right? But if people get excited about orangutans and they, understand and are excited about protecting the forests that they live in, it also protects and preserves the forests that long-tailed macaques live in, or that clouded leopards live in, or frogs and other things. And it protects important sources of rainwater and important sources of food for the local communities. And so orangutans both provide ecosystem services by seed dispersal mostly, but also by being sort of a charismatic species that people can get excited about conserving and then have sort of knock-on effects to conserve other species.
This is a very simple question, I guess. Dr. Erin has already addressed this in her presentation. In the world, in which zone does orangutan live? So yeah, she said Borneo.
Yeah, they're only
Borneo and Indonesian regions.
Yeah, they're only on two islands, Borneo and Sumatra. So both tropical forests.
Tropical rainforest. Any other questions do we have? Any other student?
Ma'am, I have one question for you. Ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, what's the reason we are not having orangutan in India, ma'am? We have lost Benny at last. We have lost Benny at last. The word is only the word is there. Apart from that, that is the word curiosity word for orangutan lone, Lone, lone.
Yeah,
Benny has died because of lone, I think. So.
If we go back like 6 million years ago, there are fossil orangutans in Indonesia. Shivapithecus basically is an ancestor of orangutans, and they were all over in India. And so my suspicion is that they were too big as the climate was changing to be able to, they couldn't find enough food to support such large bodied animals as the climate was shifting and forests were breaking up as a result of climate change over the past 6 or 7 million years. But India is actually, it's like incredibly important for understanding evolution of orangutans because Shivapithecus is all over India 6 or 7 million years ago. So if only we were there, you could go back and study them.
Yes.
The same question from Lada Bhaskar also.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah,
I think we're just here
answered
a few million years too late.
True. Yeah. So, any other questions?
No, ma'am, I think so. There is no question from the participants right now.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
So, thank you so much, Dr. Erin, and it was a great presentation.
oh, thank you. Thank you all so much for inviting me and for spending some of your day with me. I really have enjoyed speaking to you all, and I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. So if anybody has any other questions, oh, orangutans do, we think, suffer from coronavirus. So most primates and certainly all the great apes and most primates are susceptible to coronavirus. And so that's been something that's really challenging for a lot of researchers because so wearing masks and things like that and observing quarantine before going and doing research is something that we're doing to protect the wild populations, to try to keep them from getting respiratory illnesses in general, but specifically coronavirus, because we suspect that they wouldn't handle it very well.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it was great getting the opportunity to speak with you all.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.